The process by which animals maintain a tolerable internal temperature is called thermoregulation. And organisms like mammals and birds, us, are endothermic, meaning we use metabolism or internal metabolic processes to maintain a steady internal temperature. But there are organisms that regulate their internal temperature by external means, and those are called ectotherms. So they need to gain heat from external sources. And this is, fish, lizards, things like that. They tend not to be quite as precise as endotherms at regulating their internal temperature. So they're going to have to be able to tolerate a greater range than we are, for instance. If we get too far above or below 98.6, we can suffer damage. But endothermy, while it's very precise, is more energetically expensive. Right? We need to consume more calories to maintain our internal temperature. So endotherms will, create heat in a cold environment by burning more fuel, right? Cellular respiration turns glucose into ATP with the help of oxygen, and that releases heat, right? Because no transfer of energy is 100% efficient. In fact, most are far less. And so the rest of that gets released as heat, which is generally unusable energy, but we benefit from it because it maintains our internal temperature. But ectotherms will do things like go sit on a rock in the sun when they're cold, or scamper down into the shade under the rock when they're hot. So ectothermy and endothermy refer to how an organism gets regulates their body temperature, right? Endotherms get their heat from internal mechanisms like metabolism. Ectotherms get their heat from the outside. But another way to describe organisms and their regulation of temperature is how much variation they see. So poikilotherms have a lot of variation. They vary with the environment, essentially, whereas homeotherms have relatively constant temperatures. And while endotherms tend to be homeothermic, ectotherms are not necessarily poikilothermic. For instance, if you're a fish and you're in a lake that has temperatures that go up and down, you are ectothermic and poikilothermic. But if you're a fish that lives deep in the ocean, where you have a very, very stable temperature, you're not a homeotherm, right? But you are, you're not an endotherm, but you are a homeotherm, right? Because you have a constant temperature. You're just getting it from your environment rather than from your own body's metabolism. There are 4 main ways to exchange heat with your environment. And these are important for ectotherms because that's how they regulate their temperature, but they're also important for endotherms like us, right? Because we can limit them if we need to. The simplest one is radiation, right? This is just heat via like electromagnetic waves coming at you, radiating to you. This is why you come up to a fire, you hold your hands out and you feel warm, right? You sit out in the sun, you feel warm because heat is radiating from the sun across space to warm up your body. You can also gain or transfer, I should say, heat through conduction, right? So if you touch a hot stove, right, it conducts directly into your finger and it hurts, right? If you touch a cold doorknob, heat moves from your hand into the doorknob and it feels cold, but that's conduction, right? A direct movement of heat through touching. Evaporation has to do with heat loss due to water evaporating, right? So when you sweat, for instance, water evaporates off your skin, and it requires energy to raise in temperature to go from a liquid to a gas, to have that phase change, and it gets that energy from your body, and so you cool off. It's evaporation. Other organisms use evaporation too, right? You might just jump in the water when you're hot, right? And then that helps. Dogs panting, right? They have those big old tongues that allows them to evaporate a lot of water off of their tongue and cool off. Convection has to do with cooling off due to the movement of air. Now, this could be standing in front of a fan, right? This could also be the fact that hot air rises and cold air sinks. And so as hot air rises, it creates a vacuum, and cold air kind of rushes in there, and you get just a sort of a natural airflow when there are differences in temperature. So again, airflow is convection. As mammals, we use our integumentary system, right, our skin, as one way to help regulate our temperature. And we do that by insulation. We have a layer of fat, adipose tissue below our skin that insulates. Circulatory adaptations. We can route blood to the surface when we're hot so that it cools off near the surface. And that's why, if you've been out running, you might look flushed, like you've got sort of a red face. And then when it's cold out, you send the blood deeper into your body to keep your core going and to keep that blood warm. Evaporative heat, like sweating, also happens because of sweat glands in your integumentary system. Behavioral responses, right? We will also just put on a jacket or go inside or step out of the wind when we're cold. And we can adjust metabolic heat production. If we're cold, we will crank up thyroid hormone, which cranks up our metabolism and causes us to burn sugar and crank out extra heat. But while they may not have jackets to put on, other organisms have behavioral responses too. So this is an example of an insect during the heat of the day. So this is around noon, so the sun is up here, and they're making sure that the sun is touching a very small surface area of their body rather than the large surface area of their body. Right? There are also termites that will build mounds in very hot desert areas where you have hot days and cold nights, where they're very thin and flat, and the broad side faces the sunrise, faces east, so it warms up quickly during the morning. Then it's very skinny up top, and so as the sun comes down, there's not much space to heat up during the heat of the day, and then you get a little extra heat before the evening to stay warm overnight. Those are behavioral adaptations. Similar termites and ants will also dig holes that allow for essentially air conditioning and ventilation to maintain temperature in their nests. Those interested in studying the energy flow and energy transformation through organisms will study what we call bioenergetics. And this can tell you how much food an organism needs. And this will relate to your size, right? Your activity level, your environment, right? Larger organisms are going to need more energy. Organisms that do more, homeotherms, endotherms are going to require more energy than ectotherms. And you can break this down based on how we allocate our energy, how we use it, right? What do we use for reproduction? What do we use for growth? What do we use for storage, et cetera, et cetera? And if you look at the amount of energy that an organism is using in a particular unit of time, per minute, per second, per hour, per year, we can call this metabolic rate. And you can measure this usually by the amount of oxygen they're consuming or CO2 they're producing, because that gives you an idea of how much cellular respiration is going on. You can also determine it somewhat indirectly by an animal's heat loss. And typically, organisms will have sort of a standard base level of energy use. And this, for endotherms, is called our basal metabolic rate. So you have a basal metabolic rate. If you're an ectotherm, we call it your standard metabolic rate, and it's specifically at a particular temperature. And both rates are assuming that you are not stressed, that you're not growing or fasting, that you're just under typical circumstances. Generally, ectotherms are going to have a much lower metabolic rate, the standard metabolic rate, than endotherms because we're using energy to keep our temperature up. Now, size is related to metabolic rate, and larger animals tend to have a higher metabolic rate, but smaller animals have higher relative metabolic rates per gram. And part of this is larger animals are losing less heat. We have less surface area through which to lose heat to the environment, and so we don't have to do as much to maintain our temperature metabolically, whereas smaller animals do. And you can measure this with breathing rate, heart rate. You may have noticed that if you pick up like a tiny animal, like a little hamster or something, they have really, really fast heart rates. And that's because of this, right? They constantly have to keep their temperature up. In addition to size, activity affects metabolic rate greatly. So if you look at a hummingbird here, we've had a ton of hummingbirds in my yard this year. It's been wonderful. And they are constantly, buzzing around. That rate of wing movement when they're, hovering and moving around quickly requires an incredible amount of energy. So their metabolic rates are huge for their size. Contrast that with these guys. So this is the common garden spider, or Argaea p. aurantia. They come out about this time of year, so you guys may actually be seeing these around here. They're beautiful, enormous web-building spiders. But you watch them for a long time, and they spend almost all of their time just sitting still in the middle of their web. And they only move, really, when something happens to go in their web, or if they feel threatened for some reason, and they will run away and hide. But the metabolic rate for a spider, which is ectothermic, but also doesn't move very much, is very, very low. And a study of how organisms use their energy in different ways is called an energy budget. And these are graphs of energy budgets for 4 different organisms, including a human. This is a human female in a temperate climate who looks like she is pregnant. So we spend some on reproduction. Right? Note that, we are using a lot more on activity, for instance, in this penguin than in this deer mouse. But the deer mouse is going to use a lot more for thermoregulation, right? Because they're small and they're endothermic. So as compared to these two, penguin and woman, which are both endothermic but are relatively large compared to the mouse, you can see this thermoregulation budget is much smaller. If you look at an ectotherm like a snake, there is no budget for thermoregulation, right? That's just not part of the budget at all. But growth is, right? Whereas it's not a part of the budget over here because these are adult animals that don't keep growing. There's a little bit of growth here, right? Because a pregnant female has to add new tissue to take care of the fetus. But snakes are going to keep growing, right? And so they have growth as part of their budget for their whole lives. Very often, organisms have to deal with environmental conditions that are not particularly conducive to their energy needs, right? There's not a lot of food around, for instance. And if they can't get enough food to keep up with their energy needs, they might be able to reduce their energy needs. And they do that often by torpor. So a physiological state in which activity is low and you decrease your metabolism and you just do enough to keep your cells alive, essentially. And you use very little energy. Hibernation is a type of long-term torpor when you specifically in the winter will go into torpor because there's food scarcity and it's cold. But hibernation isn't the only kind of long-term torpor. There's also summer torpor, because if you live in the desert, for instance, summer is going to be a much harder time to find life. Water is going to be very scarce. Temperatures are high. And torpor doesn't have to be long-term. You can have daily torpor, right? Sometimes small mammals and birds have feeding patterns where they will kind of stop during the day. Hummingbirds do this and go into a really low metabolic state. In a minor way, this is almost like siesta, right? In the afternoon, we get tired, and there's a lot of evidence that our ancestors would nap because it was a difficult time energetically to be out in the sun. Some organisms, like tardigrades, which we'll discuss, have a process called cryptobiosis, where it almost seems like they're not alive, such a severe torpor. And they can live for years, and even in space, where there's literally nothing for them, they can stay alive. Seeds also do this. This is not an animal thing, but seeds will live in seed banks in the desert for years until you happen to get a wet enough spring to survive, and then all of these flowers will spring forward for a couple of weeks, and the desert in a rainy year has some of the best blooms you will ever see in the world.